Hey everyone, welcome to our week 3 lecture for Politics 4300. Great to have you here. I would have to say, of all the topics that we cover in this course, there's just something about integration theory. It's kind of hard to explain, but I think it goes back to when I was an undergraduate myself. And I don't think we've ever talked about this, but my undergraduate degree was in um, European government, for want of a better term. I was growing up in Ireland. I was 18, 19 years old when I went to college, and I really just had this incredible urge to study European affairs and European institutions, European government. It's not the topic I subsequently went on to specialize in, surprisingly to me. If I were to sort of time travel back and talk to myself, I think back in those days I would have been very surprised to sort of learn, I think, that I was going to go on and become sort of like more of a globalization scholar, which is what I am today. But, excuse me, um, yeah, certainly at the time, in high school, I had been part of the debate team, and we had done not just Model United Nations, but which I'm sure a lot of you would be familiar with, but we also in high school had a Model European Parliament called the European Youth Parliament, and I had gone to participate in that a number of times and really, really, really enjoyed it, really benefited from it. It's a kind of an experience, I think, that really just shaped me. And now when I look back on it, I just think of it as such a transformative time, possibly not just for my own self, but as part of, what it meant to think about a changing European society. I wouldn't, of course, have been aware of it as an 18-year-old, but now clearly, when you sort of think about the history of European integration, I was part of that generation, that early generation in the early 90s that was starting to benefit from the resuscitation of various educational aspects, programs of European integration that sort of came out of the melting of the impasse caused by the Luxembourg Compromise, and that veto that we'd been talking about, and the creation of the SEA and all the rest over the last couple of weeks. They it really opened the way for the European Commission to create a number of programs. I won't defend all of them. It's not my point. But certainly, as a young boy, young man growing up in Ireland, anyway, at the time, it's very clear to me now, looking back at that time, that what I was experiencing and the sort of new sense of awareness of a cosmopolitan world, beyond the one that I had thought I was growing up in, the opening of a door that I hadn't known previously was there. Meeting all these other people my own age from Europe, from all other countries in Europe, talking about European politics, European integration, debating with them, talking with them. It was a transformative experience for me, and I think I probably wasn't the only one. So that is our would be my kind of like opening comment or opening remark for thinking about European integration and European integration theory, which is what we are looking at this week. Now, I've got a lot to cover this week, and I'm going to have to move somewhat fast. I have uploaded some extra readings for you guys on Blackboard, and you'll find those on there for this week's reading. This lecture would be a good companion to them. My intention with this lecture is not to cover all the bases, because that would take literally, hours. But what I want to do is sort of provide kind of a primer for some of the tensions, the theoretical tensions, the controversies between various positions, and just give some definitions to some of the basic terms that these guys are using. And hopefully it'll be helpful for us as we go on through the material we're looking at the rest of this semester. So why study theory? we need to talk about this. Before we can talk about the theories of European integration, it is important, I think, to address their perspectives in a sort of a total sense, right? And this is, of course, the program of theory, which is to try to explain the significance of the processes that are driving European integration, and this is a common goal that European integration theory has with other types of social theory that you find in sociology, anthropology, political science more generally. So, there are tools and concepts that we would be borrowing for our program here from maybe some of these other disciplines in terms of the way they would explain things. And we're putting them to use here like a toolbox, perhaps in a unusual context, but certainly that toolbox approach is relevant here. But just because it's a toolbox borrowed from other disciplines doesn't mean that the specificity of the subject matter should be lost on us. Other disciplines will have various sort of topics and issues that they look at. They won't necessarily be thinking about some of the multi-level issues that we're dealing with here, because we look not just at what's going on within a polity, within the nation state, but what's going on between that polity and other levels of the game, such as the as we've been calling it before, the supranational level, right? Is that just an empty vacuum that we would call anarchy, or is the European Union really a tangible actor there? Can actors act within that level of the European Union? Is it a real space? Does it have what a polity has, which is sovereignty? A proper, well, maybe polity is not the best word to use there. Does it have what a state has, in fairness, right? A state is a sovereign entity. It's a power container, but it also has a tremendous amount of power that other actors simply don't have. The big question for the European Union is not whether or not it is a polity. I think at this stage, most people would concede that it does have the nature of a polity or a political community to some extent, but to what extent that has a genuine power and longevity of its own over and above the states that constitute it, or maybe are constituted by it. And so these are kinds of the dilemmas and questions that come out of the study of European integration at this point. So we have then, a range of issues that theory can try to address beyond the mere technical question of European integration, the mere laws, the mere question of who are the actors, who has the power, because in fact a lot of what goes on in theory in other disciplines today could be called theory of a critical nature, or even constructivist nature, if you've come across that term before, if you've taken an international relations class. Really what those theories do is they try to look at culture. And so the question then is, has the European Union, I was talking about my experience as an 18-year-old in the previous slide, and one of the questions that sort of I encountered then would be, who am I? Where is my actorness? What stage am I playing on? Where is my actorness playing out, so to speak? And of what game am I a player, or of what sort of polity am I a citizen? And those sorts of questions can't just be resolved in the sense of law or treaties, the sort of things we've been talking about up to this point in time. These are questions of feeling, and so citizenship isn't just a legal technical term. And that's of course just the perspective of one person, but when you start to think about those questions in relationship to questions of European significance, For example, we've talked a lot about the reason why Europe has not had for example, the failure of the European defence community, why Europe has not had a parallel growth and intensity of integration in the realm of defence and security, in contrast to more economic concerns. And one hypothesis there would be that while values and norms can drive change, while cultural factors, in other words, can drive change in relationship to what we'll call in this lecture low political concerns, they can't drive change at the intergovernmental level, which is the type of level, or type of game rather, that prevails when matters of high security, of high risk, are at stake. So I want to sort of reserve a sense in which we can talk about different tools for different contexts here, and we should remember that, I think, as we go forward. Now, some of the controversies then that sort of stem out of this, there are some people who are very partisan for their theory, and I think one of the questions I guess this is just the nature of who I am. Now, I'm not telling you guys what to think, but definitely I'll share with you what I think, and you can make up your own mind. It's okay if you want to disagree with me. You should disagree with me. It's healthy. But I personally don't always think of these theories as in competition with each other. Which theory explains the whole process better? I think once you look at the history of how these theories emerge and the time frames that these theories emerge, you see that the truth that the European Union represents to people is a dynamic truth, and so different theories emerge to deal with different facets of that truth in motion. So to me then, it's entirely acceptable to say certain theories explain Europe better than others at different times. Does that mean one theory wins over another permanently? No, because I think we can perhaps countenance that there are tools and concepts developed in these theories that really matter, and it's a good idea maybe not to throw any of them in the dustbin of history, so to speak, just because 10 years later something else has happened. We have a terrible tendency, I think, in international relations to constantly reinvent the wheel, and I think it's really good to sort of look back at the scholarship of the past, to learn the lessons of the past and remember them, so that we don't find ourselves ignorant just because history moves on a clip or two. So one of the things we can do with theory is we can start to ask questions. You guys are going to be asking some of these questions this semester when you think about essay topics, and among those topics, I'm not, I'll give you guys a list, I think, closer to the time the essay assignment is due, but just to give you a sense of what theory can do, theory can allow us to have debates about different actors, different sets of interests, and it can take those questions and apply them to specific historical controversies. What drove the European Union at the start of its journey? What happened in the 1970s with Charles de Gaulle and the empty chair crisis? How did that get resolved? Can culture explain that? Or was it actually French national interests that were really in the driver's seat at that point in time? What about the Single European Act? Was that a bureaucratic sort of taking over of the process, as some people would like to describe it, almost like a rational outcome, or a rationalization, or a technocratic development? Or are there other sorts of explanations? What about capitalism? Does capitalism have a role there? Was Europe kind of losing the game of capitalism, and then finally state interests had to give away? to get Europe back on the right track again? So those are really interesting questions that could be asked from a number of different perspectives, and obviously we won't have all of the perspectives today, but certainly we can talk about some of the more representative types of theories and the famous types of theories that get addressed. So let's start to do that now. Well, we cannot have this conversation today unless we talk about the work of Immanuel Kant. He's really important here because he is a major figure, not just as a philosopher, but as someone who famously, it is said, anticipated and sort of set out the blueprint of what we recognize as, the institutional development of our international laws today. Specifically, he would have been seen as someone who sort of called for something, he didn't use this term, but what we recognize as sort of pre-World War I, the League of Nations. And his famous text is the Treatise of Perpetual Peace. And today it might be said to seem something of a naive document, but certainly it has been historically powerful. Of course, the idea was that for Kant, the more democracies you had in the world, the more peaceful the world would be. Why? Because democracies can see in each other, democratic citizens can see in other democratic citizens of other countries common values, and they recognize that they have a sort of a mutuality to each other. Of course, central to Kant's definition of a republic is not so much that it's a democracy, but that it is a country that allows citizens to have a say in how laws are executed. That might sound like a bit of a dancing on the head of a pin statement there. I apologize for that. But what I specifically mean to say is that a republic for Kant is not exactly defined by the popular vote, but rather by the fact that every lawmaker is subject to the law. And so whatever law is applied to the people would also be applied to, say, for example, the monarch, the king, right? In other words, the king is taking himself out of the typical sort of situation that a king would be in, where he would be not just the maker of laws, but the executor of the laws, and not necessarily subject to them himself. So in a republican system, you have accountability, and that means that the leader cannot just do whatever he or she wants. The citizens have the right to have a say about how the so-called tax dollars are spent. Citizens in that situation then can look at another country if they see another country that has the same ability to constrain its leaders in how tax dollars are spent. Then they understand that those citizens, just like themselves, would prefer to resolve conflicts without violence because it's cheaper. War is very, very, very expensive in terms of blood and treasure. So we begin to see for Kant how republican values can come into existence, right? Because in that recognition of the expensiveness, the cost of war, you begin to see the possibility of citizens to have feelings of reciprocality towards each other. And the expectation will emerge that there's better ways of doing things, there's cheaper ways of resolving our disputes. Kant argues that these values can be strengthened through hospitality. Hospitality can come through, is a feeling that we get that can come through processes like trade, for example. So free trade can bring us into a cosmopolitan familiarity with each other. We deal with each other more frequently in our networks of trade. We come and go to and from each other's countries as merchants. And another thing then that can further strengthen those feelings, those values, would be international institutions that have a certain amount of power of law to see to it that between at least law that can exist between democracies, because democracies will want to solidify their sense of republican reciprocality, and also their processes that allow for hospitality. So the institutions can come into existence that would provide law, legal structures, accountability structures, to allow for those institutions to take on a kind of a tangibility, right? So what I'm using some convoluted language here perhaps, but what I think Kant is really sort of identifying is what we sort of recognize today as the United Nations, right? Now, this is a crucial document, but Kant's writing is crucial rather, but it also seems perhaps to us today to be a little bit naive, because in Kant's writing there's a kind of a sense that this institutionalization is going to produce perpetual peace. It's going to totally get rid of war. But we know today that while democracies don't go to war very frequently, they have done, and they probably will continue to do so. I mean, there's a number of cases that you can sort of point out where democracies have had armed conflict with each other. Not many, but definitely they do exist. So we have to account for that, and maybe the grip of interstate rivalry and jealousy still prevails. So we have to explain that. So war and the grip of interstate rivalry, the logic of balance of power, do sort of seem to be issues that continue to haunt Kant today, let alone historically. But certainly throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, I mean, I think it's kind of obvious that democracies have had trouble trouble addressing the logic of balance of power, and so Kant's hopes, Kant's call, strikes people, I think, as insufficient to the task of actually doing something to prevent these wars, like the Franco-Prussian War, or the World War I, and so obviously subsequently World War II. So how do intellectuals, how do thinkers try to address these weaknesses in Kant? What else can we do apart from follow Kant's treatise on perpetual peace and this sort of idea of a naive federalism that it seems to advocate? How do we sort of, on the one hand, sort of look at the League of Nations, for example, which is probably the most Kantian expression of international institution, the history of international institutions, and understand its failure, and yet then sort of return to the drawing board and think about how to put something better in shape or in place. And so a number of intellectuals have sort of attempted this. One, it was a Count Coudenhove Kalergi. I don't think I'm pronouncing that very well, but frankly, I do not know how else you pronounce that name. Coudenhove. Kalergi. He was the leader of the Pan-Europa movement, if you wanted to Wikipedia that or Google that for further research. Central to his arguments were the idea of a constitution for Europe. He was writing in 1926, and what he was arguing was that we had to sort of think beyond the mere legalities of it and think about Europe's natural sense of itself, and that we had to sort of tap into this sort of cultural energy in Europe before it was too late. Of course, writing after the disaster of World War I, you can understand why he'd be saying that. Another character that comes along in the scene is Aristide Briand, who wrote of a regime of European Federal Union in 1930. And I think what's key about some of these documents as well is to understand that they weren't written for academic audiences. They were written to the people. They were written to the masses. They were, in fact, manifestos, calls for people. And I would say this about Kant as well. They were, Kant is a philosopher, but I think he was also sort of writing a manifesto that, we cannot tolerate war anymore. We must do something better, right? One of the sort of tensions here that sort of comes out of these documents is that between the idea of building a supranational state or a totally federal entity of the sort that Kant had been advocating, but which was clearly failing to take root, and something more modest like a confederation, which might have longevity, but which wouldn't be powerful, right? Which wouldn't have the ability to sustain, right? So to capitulate that again for you, the pros and cons here are that a federal entity is going to be stronger in its standing, especially in its relationships with the outside world, for example. The downside would be that in a world of increasingly federalized regions, or super states, if you will, like obviously you have the United States potentially developing free trade areas with Mexico and Canada, and that's clearly happened today. The Asia Pacific Rim, Europe. You're sort of displacing the logic of interstate rivalry with potentially an inter-superstate rivalry. So that's perhaps a downside of federalism, at least insofar as it's expressed at the regional level. And one of the characters we've met before, Spinelli, Altiero Spinelli, comes in here strongly with an argument that, in fact, the only solution really is to develop a one world state. I guess it's a kind of a Marxist idea. But that, for him, was the idea that the only idea that would prevent perpetual war. So federalism definitely seen as a way in which you're going to, as the necessary step that moves us away from the repeating cycle of history that brings us back to war. And while Confederation has its place in the debate, especially because people don't like the idea of an anonymous superstate. They want to live closer to the source of power, having preferences for direct democracy, for example, mass participation. Confederation continues to have a contribution to the debate. But, again, so long as you have those powers separated, you still have the chance of repeating the tendency towards war. So, we have a few theories now to go through in the next 4 or 5 slides, and I'll try to move through it reasonably quickly. So we start our first group of theorists who are interested in the possibility of something that looks like contemporary European integration with the functionalists. Now, the key thing to know about these guys is they're not these kinds of naive Kantian federalists that we've just been talking about, who just think that the sense of hospitality and the sense of mutual regard is going to lead citizens to automatically recognize in each other the need for peaceable institutions and an international law. These guys are a little bit more sort of aware of the fact that there's a need to think through sort of scientifically ways that actors are going to be that their interests are going to be modelable, and that their tendencies are going to be channelable, if that's a word, into these kind of institutional mechanisms. And for the functionalists, the key thing is to try to get beyond the level of the state and into the state to look at its deeper populations and to look at the way history itself is in motion for the people who live in these states. So let me just kind of rehearse it for you. One of the key guys here is David Mitrany, famous dude, often said to be one of the sort of, we've been talking about founding fathers in other slides. This guy would be kind of the founding father of European integration theory. So the thing is, the idealists, the Kantians, and they were especially dominant during the interwar years between World War I and World War II. Many of the intellectuals then were Kantian in a sense. And what I mean by that is that they weren't stopping to think about how Europe could be kind of practically liberated from the iron logic of power politics. They kept kind of coming up with the abstractly perfect idea of a perpetual peace, but they weren't really interested in telling us how you get from A to B. So if you're interested in trying to get a handle on what the complaint about Kantianism is, it's that, it's not really sort of thinking beyond the idea of an abstractly perfect idea with perfectly rational citizens that are going to sort of recognize common purpose in each other. So for the functionalists, what they're bringing to the table that the Kantians don't is a realization that history itself is at work, and that the human condition as a result of that is always verifiably changing, right? And you can verify this in a scientific way. So perhaps there's some cause for hope here. So Mitrany's hunch, if you will, is that because of this changing human condition, and when I say that, what is changing for the human condition, of course, is that the world is becoming much more technological, much more complex. People have new logistical needs, and they have a desire for efficiency in order to get things done in these technological systems that more simply organized people, say peasant societies, just wouldn't have had. They wouldn't even have had an awareness of the need for some of these solutions, but people living in complex trading worlds, complex global economies need efficient institutions to get the things done that they want to get done, right? So Mitrany's hunch then is that international institutions are going to kind of naturally become more valued to human populations in this increasingly complex and increasingly sort of economically integrated world, solely on the basis of the efficiency they offer. And the key concept here is what he terms loyalty transfer. Now, the Kantian federalism, if you can get this with me here, that's going to be built in a kind of out of a grand rational kind of arrival of a self-awareness on the part of peoples in different democratic states. This is slower and it's more rooted in history. It's not a kind of a grand sort of decision to bind oneself into an international order. This is to do with changing history, changing human conditions, and a move away from the state through an appeal on a rational basis to efficiency. And the idea is, out of this complexity, you need efficiency, and out of that demand, then you have the possibility of a loyalty transfer progressively to something above the state. The state is basically an economic sort of dinosaur, if you want to put it in those terms, and we need to get past it. And people are going to realize that eventually, because of the complex nature of human history.